A warm welcome to all of our viewers in Europe and in the United States. My name is Steve Sokol, and I'm the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for this webinar today. We're a year into the new U.S. administration under President Donald Trump, and almost a year into the new coalition government led by Friedrich Merz. Both countries are navigating a rapidly changing global environment shaped by geopolitical uncertainty, shifting alliances, and growing public debate about international responsibility. And I think we'll all agree it's been quite an eventful start to the year. Following the US arrest of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, an ARD Deutschland Trend survey conducted earlier this month found that 3/4 of Germans do not believe that the United States is a trustworthy partner. The belief that the United States is a reliable partner is at an all-time low, with only 15% of respondents responding that they think the US is reliable. To talk about German and American public opinion in these uncertain times, we're joined by two polling experts. Jonathan Lehrer is Program Manager for International Affairs at the Körber-Stiftung, where he works on the Emerging Middle Powers Initiative and also serves as the editor of the Berlin Pulse, the Foundation's annual foreign policy publication. Jonathan, herzlich willkommen.
Thank you, Stephen. Dankeschön.
And before I turn it over to you, let me introduce Jacob. Jacob Poushter is an associate director at the Pew Research Center, where he conducts international survey research and writes about international public opinion, including the image of the United States abroad. Jacob, it's great to have you back again as a speaker at an ACG event.
Thank you very much for having me, Steve.
So today we thought that we'd have Jonathan present some of the most recent results from the Berlin Pulse, and then ask Jacob to present some recent data from Pew. After that, we'll have an opportunity to explore some of the trends and ask about the impact of recent developments on public opinion. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function in Zoom, and I will try to fold them into the conversation. So with that, Jonathan, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thanks for having me. Warm welcome to all of you at the screens. If you take a look at the chat, you can see a link which brings you to the Berlin Pulse, our annual public opinion survey, where you can see the data from Germany and the US. And I'll share my screen now. Stephen, is everything okay with the presentation?
It looks great.
Fantastic. So the Berlin Pulse. The Berlin Pulse is our annual public opinion publication where we poll on German and US American attitudes on foreign policy. And that's what we do here at Körber-Stiftung together with Jacob Poushter at Pew Research Center. And we're doing this since 2017. And this brings us to our methodology. So public opinion polling is interesting, but it gets especially interesting when you do it for a long time so you can identify trends. So we're doing this poll since 2017. It's a national representative sample in Germany and the US. In Germany, it's based on computer-assisted telephone interviews, and in the US, it's an online survey panel. And in Germany, we have around 1,500 German adults interviewed this year. And in the US, it has been 1,000 adults. So what we did is that we polled with our partners, Forsa and Ipsos, in mid-September. I think the data from mid-September is still very relevant today, especially when we look at transatlantic relations, attitudes on defense, NATO, also on China. One limitation, the attitudes towards Israel and the Middle East might have changed again because the negotiated peace deal for the Gaza Strip has been, I think, in October. So this is a little limitation to the data. I brought along an observation, a surprise, implication, and a limitation. And before I do that and I jump into that, I want to start with one data point which I find is one of the most telling data points in our survey. So what we did is that, and that's what we're doing every year, we asked the Germans what are the greatest challenges currently facing German foreign policy. the special thing about this question is that it's an open question. So you can just throw in up to 3 things which come to your mind. And what we see here is that the war in Ukraine is still number 1 foreign policy priority or challenge for Germans. So it's 43% of responses covering that topic. 39% of respondents refer to Israel and the Middle East, an issue which has gained a lot of significance and importance over the course of last year. Again, we polled last year in September, and 33% of mentions mention the United States or relations with the United States. And this is also a topic which has gained a lot of significance and attention, as you can see here in the chart. Migration and climate change has lost significance. This slide, from our perspective, is striking because 2 traditional cornerstones of Germany's foreign policy, having good relations with Israel and having good relations with the US, they are considered as foreign policy challenges itself. Or to put it a bit more diplomatically, relations with the United States and Israel, which are cornerstones of Germany's foreign policy, are considered as challenges. And this is something unique. Let's go into the details and also try to explain this observation. One observation is that views of the United States deteriorated in Germany. When you look at that slide, I think it's pretty clear, because we asked how would you rate the current relations between Germany and the United States. And this year it has been only 27% of Germans who say US-German relations are good, who describe them as good, and all the other respondents said German-US relations are bad. So this is the orange line, which you can see on the chart. The red line refers to the data from the US, and Jacob will explain the trends later. You can see this trend, and you can also see that the perceptions of transatlantic relations have declined sharply again since President Trump took office, and this is mirroring what we already saw during his first presidency. We think there are several reasons for this decline. So one key finding is that there is currently no policy area in which a majority of Germans view the US as a partner. So when we talk about the war in Ukraine, which is still the number 1 foreign policy challenges for Germans, as I already mentioned, and where President Trump is sending mixed signals, we see that just 38% of Germans consider the US as a partner when it comes to dealing with the war in Ukraine. When we look at, for example, promoting free trade, which is challenged by tariffs, it's just 21%. And as the chart also shows, this looked very differently during the presidency of Joe Biden in 2024. So you can see the smaller numbers, and all the numbers have declined. In addition, 38% of Germans now consider the US as a major economic threat. This is not a majority, but I wanted to show that slide because this number has risen from 17%. That's a pretty sharp increase for 1 year. This brings me to an observation which surprised us. Germans who are generally quite skeptical of China have developed a more positive, or let's say a more nuanced view of China compared to the previous years. You can see here Germany's assessment on China's rising influence since 2017. And you can see 3 camps: negative, neutral, and positive. And this year, 50% of German respondents said that China's influence is negative, while 42% of respondents said it's neutral. And the interesting thing is that the neutral and negative camp, those 2 camps, they again are moving closer to each other. And as you can see, after the outbreak of COVID, the difference between those camps became larger. So we are in a situation where the views of the US are deteriorating, and the view of China is becoming more nuanced. And the war in Ukraine is considered the number one foreign policy challenge. And Germans don't feel that the US is a partner anymore. So our question was, what is the answer? What is the answer Germans want? So we identified an implication which we called desire for action. When we look at the war in Ukraine, we see that 59% of German respondents support military assistance to Ukraine. This is a number which has dropped from 66% in 2023. Last year, it has been 57%. So we have a majority for military assistance to Ukraine. It's still existent. It's pretty small, but it's stable, especially when you compare it, for example, to the questions if Germany should support Taiwan or Israel militarily. Very interestingly here is to look at the party differences. So, for example, supporters of the Greens, the Conservatives, CDU-CSU, and SPD, those people, their support to Ukraine and the military support to Ukraine is the highest. When we look at the other end of the political spectrum, AfD supporters, for example, they just 18% of AfD supporters are in favor of supporting Ukraine militarily. There are also strong regional differences. In Western Germany, for example, it's 61% of Western Germans say Germany should support Ukraine militarily, while in East Germany, it's just 41%. So there's a significant East-West divide and significant divide when we look at party differences. So our conclusion here was an active Germany, which takes responsibility, for example, for Ukraine and also for its defense, is just possible with centrist parties, but not with political fringes. And I think this results added to that picture. 65% of Germans say Germany should send troops to Ukraine as a part of a European peacekeeping mission. I think this is a question which is going to be relevant soon. And this is consistent also with another finding when we look at the wish for the desire for action. 70% of Germans support increasing defense spending up to 5% of GDP. So there's a huge majority of Germans who want to lift Germany's defense capabilities, which is also in line with the wish from President Trump to have NATO countries spending more or 5% of GDP on defense. So we identified this desire for action, but there are also limitations. Our conclusion from this year's Berlin Pulse and our polling was that there is no Zeitenwende or no turning point in the foreign policy mindset of Germans in general. So there's still a significant and existent civilian power mindset. I have 2 slides which I'm going to show you. So this is a very interesting question. Should Germany engage more strongly on international crisis or exercise more restraint? So we have 2 camps. One camp exercise more restraint. The other camp engage more strongly. And those camps have, I would say, same size. We have no majority for one of those 2 camps. And those numbers didn't really change also after the war in Ukraine broke out. And this is consistent with another finding. Just 38% of Germans say that Germany should play a military leadership role in Europe. And also when we look here at party differences, there are huge contrasts. 80% of Green supporters want Germany to become more engaged in international crisis, compared to just 10% of, for example, AfD supporters. And this is now the transition to Jacob, who is going to compare the results from our German respondents now with the US attitudes on foreign policy.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the data from our end of the survey. There we go. Hope everyone can see that. So, what we find, first of all, I'm Jacob Poushter from the Pew Research Center. For those of you who don't know, we're a nonprofit fact tank that informs the public about issues, attitudes, and trends shaping the world. And we work to generate a foundation of facts to enrich public dialogue. So with that, let's go into the first findings, which Jonathan had already mentioned in his presentation. And as he mentioned as well, we've been surveying for 9 years now. And the big changes we saw in Germany over the last year were pretty precipitous, but they're similar to what happened in 2020 and 2016. So we saw a big change in Germany with views of the US with a big decline. They're not the only European country where we found a big decline in attitudes towards the US. We found that in France, the UK, and other Western European nations. But you see here too that attitudes towards Germany, those who say relations are good in the US, have also fallen in the past year. In the last year of the Biden administration, 84% of Americans said relations between the US and Germany were good, and that number fell to 71%. So while the change in the US is not as dramatic as it was in Germany, we do see a change in public opinion that I think, is the reality of the situation now, where relations are not as good as they were in the previous year. And when looking at the individual policy issues in terms of promoting free trade, promoting democracy, dealing with the war in Ukraine, dealing with China, and dealing with the war between Israel and Hamas, as Jonathan said before, the peace deal, there were falling numbers of people in the US and Germany who said that the other country was a partner on these issues. So in just 2 years, the percentage of Americans who say that Germany is a partner on free trade fell 10 percentage points. It fell 8 percentage points on China. It fell 10 percentage points on dealing with the war in Ukraine. So these trends in the US, again, are not as dramatic as the drops as in Germany, but there is a general sense that Germany is not as much of a partner in the current administration as it was in the previous administration. And when we ask a pretty kind of basic question about which country is the most important foreign policy partner for each of these countries, we see that in the US, the UK is the top choice. This is an open-ended question, which is why you see the low percentages. But 19% of Americans choose the UK as the most important partner for American foreign policy. And this is pretty consistent over time. That special relationship has been pretty prominent. But if you can see down there is the asterisk, only 1% of Americans say Germany. So not a lot of Americans spontaneously say that Germany is the most important foreign policy partner. On the other end, among Germans, France is considered the most important foreign policy partner. And the US at 26% has fallen off as the most important foreign policy partner. In the previous year, it was actually more people in Germany said that the US was the most important foreign policy partner to Germans. So that's another kind of big change that we saw in the data that kind of shows a potential, deterioration of the relationship between the two countries. Turning more towards American views of foreign affairs, we see a lot of differences by party. This is very common in most of the questions that we ask at the Pew Research Center. There are big divides between those who are Republican and support the Republican Party and those who are Democrat or those who lean towards the Democratic Party. On this very basic question, should the US take into the account the interests of other countries, even if it means making compromises with them, versus following its own interests, even when other countries strongly disagree, we do see that about 2/3 of Americans think that we should take into account the interests of other countries, with about 1/3 saying we should just do what we want. But among Republicans, it's almost evenly divided. 47% say take into account the interests of countries, while slightly more say that the US should follow its own interests. Among Democrats, there's very strong support for taking into account the interests of other countries. So again, this is just setting up the thought that when it comes to American foreign policy, views of American foreign policy among Americans, there are a lot of political divides. This also stretches to views towards NATO. Generally about 60% of Americans have a favorable view of NATO overall. But again, when you look under the hood and you look at views of Democrats and Republicans, Democrats are much more likely to have a favorable view of NATO than are Republicans. It's in the last survey, it was 77% to 45%. And you also see here too that the gap between the parties on this question has been growing over time. So this difference of opinion on NATO, there's always been some difference, but that gap is actually widening, with Democrats more supportive and Republicans less supportive, especially taking off at the start of the first Trump term in 2017. We also see some divides in terms of views of military assistance. As Jonathan pointed out, Germans are much more supportive of military assistance to Ukraine. Americans are the same, more support military assistance to Ukraine than they do Taiwan and Israel. But you see here too that Democrats are much more supportive of giving assistance to Ukraine, while Republicans are much less supportive. There's not many political divides on Taiwan, which is interesting. In fact, we've seen that one of the more bipartisan attitudes when it comes to American views of the world is on China. Not as many divides as there are on a lot of other issues, although there are divides emerging there, which we might have new data to show about that in the next couple months. And then Israel here too, you see Republicans are much more supportive of assistance to Israel than are Democrats, which again is a foreign policy shift that we've seen for the last a couple years or so, especially since Netanyahu has been in power in Israel. More support from those on the right in the US is a pretty common finding when it comes to views of Israel. And then when looking at American views towards other countries in general, we do see partisan divides, but also a lot of general favorability. Americans are still, as of last year, have favorable views, overwhelmingly favorable views of Japan, Canada, Italy, the UK, Germany, and France. But there are partisan divides, with Democrats more likely to say they have favorable views of these countries than Republicans. But again, still on balance, traditional allies are seen as positive in the US. When it comes to other countries, there's some more divides and some more differences. For example, Democrats are much more supportive of the European Union in general than are Republicans, 78% to 48%. Democrats are much more supportive of Mexico. It's a little mixed when it comes to India. Americans' views towards India are mixed overall. Israel, you see a reverse gap. Republicans are much more supportive of Israel than are Democrats. And we see that in a lot of the data that we show. As I said earlier, China is not seen favorably, although as Jonathan notes, in the US as well, there has been a slight uptick in favorable views towards China in the last year. And we've also seen that pattern happen in 25 countries around the world, where as views towards the US have sort of fallen since Trump regained power in the US, views towards China have actually increased slightly in a lot of the same countries. That could be a zero-sum issue where people, have to choose whether they like the US or China, and so are moving a little towards China. But in the end, that's a very interesting finding that we're seeing in our data as well, both from the US and around the world. And then you see here too, Russia and Iran are not seen very positively by Americans overall. One final note before I end my presentation is that one important fact to know about how Americans think right now is that they believe the US influence in the world is getting weaker. 52% said this as of last year. So it's really important to note that Americans see the US as getting weaker. They see European powers as really not changing much. And at the bottom of this chart, you see that an overwhelming majority of Americans think that China is getting stronger on the world stage. So that's an important thing to recognize when we're thinking about all these foreign policy changes, what the road ahead might look at. And again, just to reiterate this one more time, American views towards foreign policy are very divided by by partisan affiliation. So you see that number in the other screen, where 52% of Americans say that the U.S. is getting weaker. During the Biden administration, it was Republicans who said that the U.S. was getting weaker, and it was Democrats who said that the U.S. was not getting weaker. But since Donald Trump regained the presidency, we've seen a switch in this, where Republicans are now less likely to say that the U.S. is getting weaker, and Democrats are much more likely to say that the U.S. is getting weaker. So that's just a couple of data points that I have to share. Obviously, you can find our work online, and we have a lot more information as needed. But with that, I will just stop sharing my screen and hand it back to Stephen for some Q&A.
Thank you both for sharing those presentations and that data. Jacob, I have one quick follow-up question from somebody that just submitted a question asking whether in your polling work you also look at American attitudes to South Africa, Nigeria, and the African Union, because those are obviously countries that didn't really come up in your presentation just now.
Yeah, we do ask a lot of questions about other countries in the world. I don't recall any questions of late on views towards South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, other African states. We do have attitudes towards the US in those countries. And in the past year, they were actually fairly robust in Nigeria and Kenya, a little more mixed in South Africa. But that was before the White House confrontation with the South African prime minister, and there could have been some changes in attitudes in all those countries, with obviously military strikes in Africa, some calls towards Nigeria. So those things are always changing. But yes, on the American side, I don't recall that we've asked a specific question on views towards Nigeria and South Africa, at least in the last couple of years.
And then I wanted to sort of pick up on some of the comments that both of you made about military assistance to Ukraine. From what Jonathan was saying, it sounded as if sort of support for providing attitudes about supporting military support for Ukraine has dropped off a little bit in Germany. Jacob, you were talking about the divide between Republicans and Democrats. I think you said that about a third of Republicans, 28%, are supportive of military assistance to Ukraine, and just over 50% of Democrats are supportive. How has that changed over time in the US? Has there been a drop-off of support as well?
I'll answer the U.S. side, and yes, there has been a drop off. When we first asked this question in March of 2022, about 42% of Americans said that the U.S. was not providing enough assistance to Ukraine, and only 7% said too much. By 2025, that number was about a third who said that we were providing too much. And it was about 50% among Republicans who said that the U.S. was providing too much, while Democrats were still pretty much saying that the U.S. was either not providing enough or it was about right. So there has been a decline in the percentage of Americans who want to give military assistance to Ukraine, and that decline has been mostly among Republicans, although there has been a bit of a decline among Democrats as well.
And Jonathan, one of our viewers submitted the following question, which I think ties in with what you were talking about. Isn't the specific support for Ukraine more meaningful than general attitudes about restraint versus leadership when looking at general public opinion? And doesn't the support in Germany for Ukraine actually show a Zeitenwende and a change in mindset?
I think it's a very good question, and it's a question how you define Zeitenwende. So when we listened to the speech of Olaf Scholz, Zeitenwende was about supporting Ukraine, but it was also about taking a military leadership role in Europe besides the issue of Ukraine and the issue of defense spending. And what we see in our polling is that everything which is related to Russia and Ukraine, there is a majority of Germans who say we should spend more on defense, we should do something, we should invest. Everything besides Ukraine and besides Russia, there is no change at all. Even though other things have changed, even though China has changed, the United States has changed. And this led us to the conclusion, or they gave us the conclusion, that there's no general shift in mindset. And our reading is that the war in Ukraine is not just a war in Europe, which is extremely painful for the Ukrainians, but Germans also feel threatened by Russia. This is also what our data shows us. When you look at the report, you can see that it's now 47% of Germans who say Russia is a major military threat, and this number has risen every year by year. And those people who consider Russia as a threat, of course, or not of course, but majority of those people want to support Ukraine. But this does not come along with a favor for military engagement in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. As these survey results have come out and as you've done your reporting, I'd be curious in hearing what the reception has been in Berlin, in Washington, to some of the data that you've provided. Has there been like surprise at these results, or has it been something that people have taken in stride given the political changes? And then, I definitely want to get into where we are today, given that the survey data that both of you have presented is sort of a snapshot in time and doesn't necessarily reflect some of the more recent developments. But what was the initial response or reception to the survey results?
So I would say, Stephen, that politicians which know our polling, and we are also we are always presenting those numbers to the Bundestag and to ministries. They always give us feedback if they like the numbers they see, and if they don't, they like the numbers they see. It's getting a bit more quiet. So I think everything related on defense was received very well. But really surprising, I think the results who were really surprising was everything related to Israel, because people were and decision makers were expecting that people in Germany are not supportive of Germany's military assistance to Israel, to the Israeli government. But it's just 15%. I think that number is really low, and decision makers didn't really expect that. But back on the defense and Ukraine field, we have this poll which shows that there's a majority of Germans who support German peace troops in Ukraine if there is a ceasefire to be reached. And our institute, our polling institute Forsa, asked the same questions in summer. And in summer, they didn't find a majority. And in September, they found. And I think this is also a data point which surprised decision makers. Because we also had a very heated debate about conscription here in Germany.
And I mean, I'll just add that generally, I think because this is the second time that Donald Trump has been president of the United States, a lot of the findings about America's image declining around the world, people with less confidence in Trump than Biden, although Biden's confidence had been falling during his term, probably on account of Afghanistan and Israel and a couple other factors, maybe also including his age. We did know from the first Trump term that there wasn't a lot of support for his administration in Germany and other Western European countries. So the findings that we gathered last year that showed a decline in U.S. favorability and confidence in the U.S. president, not a lot of confidence in Trump and his attributes or his policies, was not particularly surprising to us. So we didn't see a lot of reaction that was kind of shocked by that. We did find, though, too, that one of Trump's most positive, well, maybe not positive, but where people said he was a strong leader, and that was something that we saw in a lot of the data. So it might have been the actual actions, of last year might have been shocking to a lot of people, but the fact that Trump came in and changed a lot of things and made a lot of decisions was not necessarily off from what people have been telling us on surveys internationally over the last decade or so.
So in light of that, how do you think and I understand completely that this is conjecture, but how do you think that some of these responses might have changed since the data was collected, given the events so far this year? I mean, one of our viewers asks, for example, do Americans still feel that the U.S. is weaker even after the Iran intervention and the operation in Venezuela, the recovery of hostages in Gaza, and other developments that have happened over the last few weeks?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it is hard to speculate about how public opinion might change. I will couch the response in kind of two overarching issues. One is that, as I made very clear, partisan attitudes in the U.S. tend to dictate approval or disapproval for the president's actions. There's almost usually support from Republicans in terms of what actions he takes internationally, and there's usually opposition among Democrats among actions that Trump takes internationally. So I don't think that would be much different in the future. Polling on the Venezuelan action seemed pretty split when a lot of the data came out. I don't expect that necessarily to change. Generally, there's still relative opposition to taking control of Greenland, for example, but there is more support among Republicans for that action. So it's hard to know exactly where it's going to move. I would say on the weaker question, it's kind of the same thing. Now, in the current world, it's probably Democrats who are saying that the U.S. Is weaker. Republicans would probably think the opposite, that the U.S. is stronger and that it's making changes in the world that people might appreciate from the right. And so, it's really hard to know exactly what it will be. I will say that it's likely that views of the U.S., international image of the U.S., and confidence in Trump would not really have improved over the past year, based on my historical knowledge of how these things go. But that number was already pretty low. So I don't know if there will be a change on U.S. image and confidence in the U.S. president. But we do have a survey of 35 or so countries coming out in the late spring, early summer that will hope to answer those questions.
Thanks, Jacob. Jonathan, I mean, along the same lines, I'd be interested in your take about how some of the survey results might have changed since the data was collected in September. Of course, I started our conversation today with some information from an ARD Deutschland trend study that shows a precipitous drop in how the U.S. is perceived. From some of the work that you've been doing, what have you been seeing and hearing?
Yeah, I mean, the poll from Deutschlandfunk is very telling. So there is overall, I think, for example, opposition when we talk about the annexation plans of Greenland. But I think looking back at our survey helps us. And what we saw is that, for example, when President Trump got elected, German attitudes toward the US didn't really change. But when he came into office, then it changed. So it's not about the person itself or the party, it's about what happens and which action they take, and if they are in European and German interests. And the trends we see is that the more or the worse the attitudes towards or the assessment of transatlantic relations is, the bigger is the desire for European answers, and also to engage with countries like India or Brazil to find free trade agreements. And I think this desire is getting even bigger. That's what we expect.
Mm-hmm. Coming back to defense spending and NATO, because that's a theme that was covered in the data that both of you shared. I'm curious if there was anything revealing about public opinion on increased burden sharing on either side of the Atlantic, i.e., on the American side, any data that really raises the expectations of what the Europeans, the NATO partners, should be doing when it comes to burden sharing. On the German side, there certainly seems to be an awareness that there needs to be a greater investment in defense. I think that you had said, Jonathan, up to over 70%
Yes.
of respondents said that there should be an increase in defense spending. For me, that's a sign of recognition that Germany needs to take on more of the burden of its own defense. But were there any questions that focused at all on the burden sharing piece of this?
Jacob, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, from the American perspective, I showed the views of NATO are generally favorable, although there's partisan differences. Most Americans still say that NATO provides a benefit to the United States, that there's a benefit as being a part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organizations for Americans. At the same time, there's also a sense that America is, a superpower and can kind of sometimes deal with its own things by itself, especially among those who support the Republican Party and older Americans. So we have this data point from late last year that 38% of adults say it's important for the US to be the only military superpower in the world. The only, and that number actually jumps to 63% among Republicans. So there is a lot of support. Sorry, 53%. So there's a lot of support for the U.S. being, the military leader in the world. But at the same time, there is still a sense that the U.S. benefits from relationships with other countries, and specifically through the NATO alliance. I don't think we have any data specifically on the targets of military spending by GDP, but Jonathan, I think, might have a little more information on that from the German side.
And I guess the question there too is, how might this have changed in light of all of the rhetoric over Greenland over the last few weeks as well?
Yeah, that's to me an open question still. That if people still, a threat to an alliance member, what that means for the future of the NATO alliance. I will also say, it's always important to keep in the back of your mind that when it comes to American views of foreign policy, it's typically not at the top of people's list in terms of what they're concerned about. Obviously people have a lot of, different things that are going on in their lives. They're probably worried about prices, worried about the economy, maybe worried about a lot of domestic issues that are going on right now. While, a lot of people in the foreign policy world might see these as big questions about alliances and, what the future of American power holds in the world. I think a lot of Americans may not be as tuned in as people think. So it's unclear, exactly what would happen in this scenario. But, again, I think our data does point to the fact that Americans still believe in kind of traditional allies, still have more favorable views of Western Europeans, those in the G7, those in the NATO alliance. And I don't know if that will change in the future, but it's definitely worth keeping on asking our trends and keep on asking our questions to see if opinions do shift over the next year, especially if something, of that magnitude happens.
And if I may, Stephen.
Yeah, go ahead.
So we didn't ask something specifically on burden sharing. Well, we have asked on NATO before in the years before, and Germans' attitudes towards NATO are, I would say, positive, but not very enthusiastic, but positive. I'd say those 72% of Germans who say we're in favor of high military defense spending. I'm not sure if that's really about burden sharing, but it's about investing in its own defense. Because first reason, people are afraid of Russia, and second reason, that the trust in the security umbrella of the US is pretty low. This is a number we have also included in the Berlin Pulse. We asked, can Germany still rely on the US nuclear umbrella for its security? Is 62% of Germans who say no, and then 75% of Germans say Germany should seek a nuclear umbrella from France and the United Kingdom. So again, the answer is Europe. At least the desire is to find a European backup or a European answer to that insecurity.
Thank you. So somebody just added an interesting question that ties into all of this, and I was actually going to ask about energy and climate policy a little bit later, but Or actually, let me start with that. Both of you talked a little bit about the drop off in confidence when it comes to trade relations between Europe and the U.S. Um, to what extent do you think that people see economic cooperation as a priority for the German-American relationship moving forward, or is there real concern about the reliability of that partnership?
May I start, Jacob?
Right, Jonathan. Yeah.
I think what we see in our data is that are we getting into a direction where people in Germany or decision makers in Germany start to discuss how to de-risk from certain parts of the US economy. And that's a term we used for China because we are now seeing the pressure coming from the tariffs, also the problem with the tech industries. And I think this question is also related to defense because the German economic model, I get it needs good economic trade relations with the US, but defense spending in Germany is, when we talk about defense spending, it's always related to our economic situation. And if we have the economic resources to spend so much on defense. And I think this is the very difficult question when we talk about increasing defense spending, is that our budget is limited, and then we have to do cuts here and there. And doing those cuts in other fields is getting more difficult when trade relations, for example, with the US or China, is getting more difficult. So this is getting Germans and Germany in a very, very difficult spot, and we can already see that in the polls. But economic relations itself are not considered as a foreign policy challenge. Also, energy is not considered as a foreign policy challenge anymore. This has changed, but I think this is just due to the fact that there are so many open and clear conflicts and crises in the world with which have gained so much attention.
Yeah, and I don't have much to add to that. I mean, Americans generally don't really like the idea of tariffs from our own data sources from last August. There's not a lot of approval for it. At the same time, I'm not sure that, when it comes to economic attitudes and trade overall, I think generally China stands out as more of a priority issue for the U.S. in terms of that relationship. I mean, we haven't asked a specific question on trade with one country versus another, but we do get a sense that about 60% of Americans see China as an economic threat to the United States, and I do think that's where a lot of the economic issues do tend to lie in the minds of the American public. When it comes to the administration and policies towards tariffs and retributions and all that, we have pretty little data on that because, as I said earlier, that's a concept that might be a bit outside of what an American typically thinks about. So it's kind of hard to ask questions about those really complicated trade issues.
So let me sort of ask a couple of follow-up questions that tie in here. I mean, I guess one is I found it fascinating in Jonathan's presentation to see that the sort of climate change has really dropped off as one of the big foreign policy issues that people are thinking about. And I guess the question to both of you would be how the public in Germany and in the US view greater cooperation on things like energy security and climate policy, whether there could be an opening there at a time when there's not a lot of confidence in the bilateral relationship.
I mean, I can start because we have some actual data from last year on views of international threats, which we've been asking for over a decade. And we found a really sharp decline in those who are saying that climate is the biggest threat to their lives. In fact, false information and kind of like other issues, went to the top of the list for the first time in a while. So we're not just seeing kind of a lack of, I think, interest in that policy issue from Americans, but around the world, it seems to have declined as a top issue, and that might be because of lack of leadership from the United States. There's very negative views towards Trump's handling of the climate issue as of last year's survey, and obviously pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords and all those things are not making the world kind of look to the U.S. for a leader in that view. But overall, that declining view of climate change as a major issue is pretty common across the world, not just in the U.S. and Germany. So, Jonathan, I don't know if you want to add some more on that.
We don't have questions on climate cooperation. But I just saw in the chat there is one guest who was asking about generational differences. And what's interesting is that climate change is also not again on the foreign policy radar for young people. And that has changed in Germany. So when we polled last year and the year before, climate change was a foreign policy challenge for people between 18 and 34. And that is not the case anymore. And we think that is due to the economic problems we have in Germany. So just attention is somewhere else. That is our explanation. And one major generational difference which we polled is not existent anymore. It vanished.
So yeah, I was going to raise some of these demographic differences. Obviously, there was a question in the chat about whether there are generational differences across the responses in each of your studies. But also there was a question about geography. Jonathan, you had talked a little bit about some of the distinctions between East and West. There was a question, Jacob, to what degree Pew also looks at regional differences between the coasts and the South or the Midwest in its work.
Right. I mean, it's a good question for the U.S. Generally, we don't see huge regional differences on these types of attitudes. Generally, partisanship is by far the most common difference, and the geographic spread out of partisan affiliation isn't particularly big by the region, which is the four census regions: West, South, East, Midwest. So generally, no, there aren't huge regional differences. In terms of age, older Americans are more likely to see China and Russia as a threat. That's something we see in our data, in both as a military threat and as an economic threat. And young people are also less likely to say that the U.S. should take an active role in world affairs. They're less generally, tuned into that in the U.S., less likely to say that the U.S. should be, the only military superpower. So, there's some data from the U.S. that shows young people are maybe a little less tuned in to these issues than our older Americans.
So these surveys, that you've shared with us, really have a strong focus on foreign policy, not as much on domestic policy. But one of our viewers is curious what sort of the domestic implications might be, and particularly as we head into midterms here in the U.S. with some state elections in Germany. How do these kinds of survey results affect public opinion in the confidence of the respective country's leadership?
Jacob, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, from my past understanding and research on American foreign policy attitudes is that they do tend to usually prioritize domestic affairs over foreign affairs on many realms, except when it comes to like economic and security concerns. So terrorism, concerns about safety for within the United States. And then if there's economic issues, there might not be the connection between, let's say, tariffs on another country and prices, but generally, I think Americans do focus more on, and for the most part, do more focus on domestic issues when it comes to their own public opinion. But at the same time, the views of the U.S. president as a being part of the global community, being a world leader, does come into play, and I do think does affect confidence in the U.S. president to handle international affairs and overall approval. But my speculation is that foreign affairs and the relationship between the US and Germany, for example, is probably a bigger, public opinion deal in Germany than it would be in the United States, just because of the size of the United States, the myriad partnerships the US has with other countries, and a host of other issues. Jonathan, if that makes sense.
Yes. I think when we look at the past surveys from 2017, we learned that foreign policy never really mattered for elections in Germany, but that has changed at least for the last election, where we saw that peace, the word peace, has become a term in every election campaign from every party. Every party wanted to deliver on peace, and some parties have been successful on running with that, and other parties have not. And I think as long as the war in Ukraine is going on, and as long as relations with other countries are that complicated, that kind of that topic will still be a term or a word which the parties will use to find more support among their electorate.
So given sort of that the results of your work give a somewhat pessimistic or at least sort of uncertain outlook on the state of the German-American partnership and the sort of trust and confidence in the other partner, and we've seen declining trends in both countries. Was there anything that gave you sort of a glimmer of hope, or any areas where you said, hey, here could be some opportunities for greater collaboration between Germany and the US and for the transatlantic partnership writ large?
That's a very good question, Stephen.
I mean, as you think about it, I mean, I'm wondering, both we've touched on China a little bit. Obviously, we've seen in some of the data, China maybe being more positively perceived than it was previously, at the same time as the U.S. perception is less. More eyes are on China. Are you seeing opportunities maybe for greater alignment on China policy between Europe and the US? Or is it really sort of a zero-sum game of interest in one country waning and interest in another country increasing?
So the polls of last year showed us that Germans don't really consider the US as a partner on China. So I think, and this also can be an optimistic outlook. I think the US and Germany their relations can deliver on trade and economic success, and I think that's still a possibility and a window of opportunity. Even now there are difficulties between the administrations, but that might also change. And when we look at the history of the transatlantic relations, I think it's very important to note that transatlantic relations have not always been or found huge support in Germany, but then they gained support by delivering for people, especially after the Second World War. After the Second World War, transatlantic relations, having good ties with the US, weren't really popular among Germans, but via the Marshall Plan and economic relations and economic success and trade, transatlantic relations became popular. And I think this is a really important lesson. You can have differences and you can have difficulties, but if they deliver, or if the relations deliver in the long run, that's okay, because then you will again find support among the public. If those relations don't deliver in the long run, then you get a problem.
Yeah. And just briefly, on China, as noted earlier, Americans are softening their views on China. There had been a pretty sharp decline, pretty strong drop in favorability towards China, more calling China an enemy, a lot of concern about the cooperation between China and Russia when it comes to Ukraine. But we have seen a bit of an uptick in terms of favorable views of China in the U.S. So China might be taking advantage of this situation in terms of not just endearing itself to the rest of the world that might see it as a zero sum between the U.S. and China, but also among Americans themselves. It's still not a positive thing, but I do think that's one area where there could be some change in the future, especially too as it's also one of the issues where there hasn't been a huge partisan divide in terms of attitudes towards China. It's generally negative among both parties. Republicans more because of the leadership of China and the Communist Party. Democrats more because of the human rights issue in China. But there is potentially some evidence that some of those views are softening over time, and that could be a big change when it comes to the world order. If America loses influence and China gains influence, that could be a very different world than the one we've lived in for the past couple decades.
Well, Jacob and Jonathan, thank you so much for sharing this important data with us. And I look forward to continuing the conversation with both of you as you conduct more surveys and continue to measure the pulse of what's going on in both countries. I think it's extremely important to take these snapshots and figure out where public opinion is, even if we don't always have all of the information that we want to have to be able to assess where we are and where we're going. But I think it's very useful to just get a sense of public sentiment at any given time. So I want to thank both of you for the very important work that you both do and that your organizations do, and for sharing it with us and with our audience today. Herzlichen Dank.